Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for a new episode of Leonid's Live Lounge. And today we have Richard Bistrong, who I'm sure does not need an introduction to many here. But Richard is the CEO of Front-Line Bribery, and he's actually joining today from Italy. And it looks lovely. And for those that don't know about Richard's background, what we'll do is put his website on the show notes here for you to be able to review. Richard, with all of your compliance work over the years, I'm sure you have seen a lot of successful career chapters. But maybe today we could talk about what you've seen that could have been done better. Let's say you were speaking to friends or colleagues that were looking to apply for positions within compliance. What do you think would be your non-negotiables for them?
Yeah, great question, Jamie. And I want to thank you and the Leonid Group for the invitation to join you today from here in Tuscany. And also thank Andy McBride for introducing us. So I'm looking forward to listening to that episode. Thank you, Andy. So look, I've seen so many positive career trajectories and wonderful transitions and career growth from one organization to another. We're not going to talk so much about those today, but that is the majority of what I've seen.
I can concur with that.
But Jamie, I've seen some things go wrong as well. And, looking at it now, if I were applying for a role in a new organization, there would be some non-negotiables based on my experience with friends and peers and colleagues. So maybe we, not necessarily in order of importance, but let's unpack them one at a time, sort of the elephants in the room.
Yeah.
Is the first thing I would want to know is the role resourced? And I would want to dig into the details of that. For example, am I leading a team? What type of discretion do I have in hiring, if there are roles to be filled? Is there a learning and education budget? Is there a travel budget? Like I want to make sure that the resources that the company is prepared to provide matches the scope of the responsibility. And I have seen that go the wrong way in terms of some friends, peers, and colleagues have gone to organizations where it's a nice role, it's a nice title, but for lack of a better term, it's been a little bit of window dressing in that once they're under the hood, so to speak, in the organization, there is a lack of what one attorney friend of mine called respect and resources, right? So 2 R's. And I would want to know in great detail what that looks like from an org chart perspective and also from a financial perspective. And if an organization wasn't prepared to share that in advance, that would be a non-negotiable.
And I always say that as well when I'm working with clients and candidates. There's no point putting your head in the sand with regards to the financials. Otherwise, all that will happen is there'll be a long interview process, and at the end of that, the company's got one figure in mind, and the candidate has the other, and the gap will not be. They will not be able to close that gap. Have that conversation at the beginning. Make sure it's realistic and fair for the role title, rather than further down the process. I think that's really
and if I'm expected to build a team, I would want to know what that process is. In other words, am I going to have a role and voice in how these new positions or new hires are structured? Am I going to be in lockstep and teamed up with HR in terms of advertising the role and hiring, or am I sort of ring-fenced from that process until a certain point? That's another non-negotiable I would want to know. If there are roles to be filled, that would be reporting to me.
Yeah, I agree. And also, are they just promising this headcount, or have they gotten through a budget approval already for this headcount? How concrete are these hires? Because a lot, if you get in on day one and suddenly these team hires aren't as concrete as you imagined, it'll be a lot of work on your plate. From
Exactly. So my other non-negotiable, and Jamie, this is probably not for the first round of interviews, but let's say I've made it through, a few rounds, and it seems like things are progressing in a positive direction. At some point, I'm going to say, I think we're now at the point of signing an NDA, and I would like to know what the active internal investigations are in the organization, and if there are any negotiations that haven't been disclosed publicly as part of regulatory filings, what that looks like as well. I have seen a number of cases where there have been some unpleasant surprises after an individual has been onboarded, where there are internal investigations and governmental negotiations going on, and it wasn't an easy start, right? It wasn't. The person was thrown into investigations that they didn't know existed when they took the job. So I would want to know in advance, again, probably midway through the interview process, let's sign an NDA. What does this landscape look like right now?
Because then at least they know exactly what they're walking into, and it may not scare them off. It could be an exciting challenge for them. If a company's under DOJ investigation or FCPA monitorship, that's quite a unique opportunity in the compliance space. But it's more about knowing what you're getting yourself into at the beginning.
That's right. There was one example where, once you're onboarded as a new ethics and compliance team member, it's not always the easiest way to meet people on the team if you're heading up an investigation and that's your first exposure to the corporation. I would at least want to prepare for that in advance. It's not to say it's a deal breaker, but again, like you shared, let's know what we're walking into.
And in compliance, it's so much about being able to build trust with key stakeholders so you can get buy-in for what you're looking to achieve. And if you are walking straight into an investigation on day one, it will make it that bit harder to build trust with those people.
Absolutely. I think another one of my non-negotiables is I would want to know, sparing no detail, what does the onboarding process look like for the first 90 days?
That makes sense. And I think and that's also part of the candidate, they should also be able to bring their own ideas to that. If they're coming in to make an impact from day one, they should be able to provide some guidance as to what they expect the first 90 days to look like. But the company should also be able to provide their perspective on this too, and be able to hopefully meet in the middle and come up with a firm plan for the first 90 days.
And I think that's there's sort of the micro onboarding and the macro onboarding. So when I'm thinking about the macro onboarding, Jamie, and again, for me, this would be a non-negotiable, is do I have, for lack of a better term, a honeymoon period where I have time, resources to meet not only people on the global compliance team, if I have peers and colleagues in other parts of the world, but if I'm focused on a particular subject matter, for example, if I'm brought in on the anti-bribery team, will I have a chance in the first, whether it's 60, 90, 120 days, to go ahead and meet some of the higher risk commercial teams and get to know them? Like, what does that look like? Or am I expected day one, well, here's what's going on right now, we need you to implement this, you'll have time to meet people later? Okay, so what's that look like from high altitude?
I think it's really important. It goes back to something you said earlier as well around understanding travel allowance and travel budget. And that's, a lot of these companies will be global, operations around the world, and teams are usually structured globally. And you will want to go and meet your team members. And that will require travel allowance. And in addition to the team members, as you say, will also be those high risk commercial areas that you want to go and meet in person as well. And if there isn't allowance for that, you need to be able to do this all via Teams or Zoom. It will very much limit the initial impact that you can have.
So there was an article in the Harvard Business Review about, I don't want to be, when I'm onboarded, I don't want to be over onboarded, right? I don't want to meet and have to do and interact with those that I'm not necessarily going to have a lot of future interaction with. I want to make sure that early on I'm going to meet the people that I really do need to meet. So I want to know in as much detail as possible, what does that sequence look like at the beginning? Who are the people that I'm going to be meeting? Who are the people I'm going to be introduced to? How much time do I have to get to know my team? What are the specific expectations of this role early on? Because once that trajectory is set, it's going to be hard to change it a year down the road, or even 9 months down the road. From the micro sense, and what one might laugh at this, but who's going to give me my key fob to get into the building? What are the office arrangements? Will I have a computer day one? What's my access to company resources? Will I be able to look at the code of conduct? And I have seen some really awful stories about no one knew where my desk was. Right?
Yeah.
I had no access to a computer, and I had to go like asking around, like, how do I even get started?
Yeah.
I don't want to leave that by chance. I want to know exactly what all that looks like.
It's a really important part, and it's something when we're working with clients as well, because there's that gap between having a candidate accept an offer and signing an employment contract and starting the job, which in the US, a lot of the time that's 2 weeks. But in Europe, that could be a 6-month gap between signing contract and then notice period and then onboarding. And it's about how to keep communication with that candidate over that time, what can be done in the interim. And then as we get towards day one of starting the job, as you say, making sure that all these small details have been thought about, especially if the interview process was 3 months before or 6 months before. It's almost like you need to remind the candidate of why they've joined this company and this role. And the onboarding day one is so important to that, because it will, as you say, it will set a precedent for how they see the company going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be sitting at the reception desk day one saying, "No, I really do work here. This person was supposed to notify you," and but that has happened, right? And so I think we really need to be mindful of these things well in advance. So I think what are the resources? What's the respect going in? What does the onboarding process look like from a macro perspective, from a micro perspective? I think, and then again, let's talk about what are the active investigations that are there, because it might be also that you're expected to deal with some investigations where you don't have that subject matter expertise. So you might say, you know what, this might not be the right role for me because the fires that you have now that you're expecting me to put out, that's not really my background.
And you'd rather know that at the beginning and make that decision that it's not right for me, because otherwise, again, it will only cause pain further down the line there as well. And compliance is a small world. You don't want to burn bridges.
No, and you don't want to have on your LinkedIn profile, it doesn't help anyone when it's like you worked at an organization for 6 months. I mean, that's a failure on everyone's part. So hopefully some of these pointers can, again, they're not highly complex, but I think they're often highly forgotten.
I 100% agree. I think some people, it's very easy to forget these points when there's so much going on when you're going through an interview process. You're potentially starting a new job. It's so exciting. It's a big change in your life, but it's important to remember these basics before doing it, rather than finding out too late.
Yeah. I think the more difficult part is, how do you really get to know the culture of a company first of all, before you even apply for the role, and then once you're in the application process, how do you get to know what it's really like? I think LinkedIn's made that a little easier for us, because the compliance community is a highly transparent one. It's a close community. And I think that we all probably have a small group of people on our A list that we could reach out to that may have worked at this organization and will tell you, I guess, as we say in the US, I don't know if they say it here in Italy, like the good, bad, and the ugly. Like, here was my experience. I'm not saying that that's the way it is now. I'm not saying that every role is that way, but try to get some informal feedback from your A level contacts about what the organization is like. So, and if you don't have those, you probably are one degree away from asking someone who can introduce you to someone for that.
Yeah, it's a very well connected space in compliance. I think that's really important. I do think there are also ways you can at least try and get under the hood as to the cultural fit during an interview process. Certain questions that you can ask. I usually recommend to candidates that they don't. They also ask about what's this person's management style. What can you tell me a bit about the personalities of the existing team members? How do they like to operate? And in an interview process as well, you're usually not just speaking to direct team members, but other stakeholders that may not be in this department. And again, there I would be asking about how did they find it when they were starting at this company, and they should be quite open. And as you say, the good, the bad, the ugly. I always recommend in interview processes to not shy away from the fact that not everything's in place. It may be a bit chaotic at the beginning, or whatever it may be. I think it's important to be honest about that, because for the right person, that'll be fine. That they understand that it will be a bit chaotic, and they like that, but they'd rather know in advance. And I think there is ways in interviews that you can try and get into those details.
Agreed. Because when you think about it, when a company does hire someone, there's clearly an expectation that it's a good fit, right? They're not going to make a job offer if they didn't think it was going to work out. So, having seen more than a few cases, not cases, but instances where it hasn't worked out, and I've talked about that even sometimes, mostly, if not always informally with friends and colleagues. I think there are some common threads there. The culture wasn't what I thought it was. The onboarding was painful. I didn't know about this investigation. I didn't have the resources that I thought I was going to have. So I think, those are some common themes that I've seen in these conversations.
Yeah. I think a lot of the time it boils down to expectation management on both sides. And yeah, that's usually the main issue. It could be a few different areas of that, but they come in expecting one thing, the company comes in expecting a different thing, and that gap is too far apart to make work.
Yeah.
So yeah. Well, look. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, but sort of wrapping up where we started. Most of the time, it works out great for everyone, right? And we just have to go to LinkedIn to see people that are growing their careers in this field, that are highly successful. And I'm also thinking about not only going from one role to another, but going from one industry to another. So it could be from oil and gas to med tech. So we've seen so many careers wonderfully built. And so these are more exceptions than the rules. But I think with a few little items on our checklist, we can even get more of those successes out there.
And I'd like to concur with that as well, that the vast majority of the time, it's an extremely smooth and exciting process, but you need to make sure you're ticking these boxes while going through a process. But Richard, thank you so much for having this conversation with us and taking time out of your vacation in Tuscany. I really appreciate that. And I look forward to getting feedback from our listeners as to how they found this. But again, thank you.
Pleasure, Jamie, and hope to see you in person in London sometime.
I very much look forward to it. Have a great day.
Thanks. You too.
Bye-bye.